Over the years, Sodor had seen many engines come and go, but none have lasted longer than those on the Fat Controller's railway. This year would mark 65 years since stories about the railway first appeared in books. In honour of this, there was to be a special presentation at Peel Park. The Fat Controller had asked Thomas to collect a statue that would mark the occasion and celebrate the Sodor Railway. Why should Thomas collect it?
He can't do anything a strong express engine can,
huffed Gordon. Nor what a splendid red engine can do also, agreed James. It should have gone to her best friends, added Percy. Thomas didn't care a bit. He'd been picked for the most important job. You're only jealous, he said, and settled down to sleep. The following morning, when Thomas pulled into the docks, Cranky was still unloading.
Awkward thing,
the crane groaned.
What is in this heap of junk?
Didn't you know? Peeped Thomas. That's the statue to celebrate the railway. It's 65 years since the Finn clergyman wrote his first book about us.
No wonder you look so cheerful, snorted Cranky. Who cares anyway? It's not like it's going to be a statue of you.
Thomas just ignored him and watched the men open up the crate. When they had finished, the statue was still covered with a large tarpaulin. Thomas's eyes suddenly widened with excitement, for it had a very familiar shape. You know what, Cranky? He called. It really could be of me. Look!
I haven't the time, cranked Cranky. There's work to be done. These ships won't unload themselves, you know.
All right, don't get your hook in a twist, chuckled Thomas. This made Cranky very cross.
Little blue bug,
he muttered to himself. When Thomas got home that night, his boiler was almost bursting. He was eager to tell the others his thrilling news. They were all asleep. Percy opened a bleary eye, and soon wished he hadn't. Percy! Percy! Thomas whispered. I think the statue is of me. Percy was too tired to think properly. Really, Thomas? He yawned. That's... nice. Thomas didn't sleep a wink that night. He was far too excited. It's not fair, groaned Henry next morning.
Yes, why should the statue be of Thomas? Grumbled Gordon. I've been here far longer than he has.
As have I, agreed Henry. It's
disgraceful, fumed Gordon.
Disgusting, said James. Despicable, finished Henry. Thomas took no notice. You're still jealous, that's all, he teased.
Ha!
Snorted Gordon. And that day, wherever he went, from Wellsworth to Maythwaite, Thomas talked about his statue to anyone that would listen. But not all were pleased for Thomas. In fact, most were quite cross. That afternoon, an indignation meeting was called.
He's becoming a muckle nuisance, fumed Douglas. Chatting about himself all the time,
Donald added.
If this railway is to be celebrated with a statue of Thomas, announced Gordon, then I propose we should leave.
Leave the island? Squeaked Percy.
Yes,
hissed Henry.
And when you next see Thomas, you can jolly well tell him. And the Fat Controller too, mind, added Gordon.
Why is it always me? Cried Percy. Later, he arrived to find Thomas was still boasting. Stop going on about that thing, demanded Percy at last. Thomas was taken aback. We're all threatening to leave Sodor, added Percy. If the railway is to be celebrated with a statue of only you, we might as well leave you to run things yourself. Percy huffed away, leaving Thomas stunned. But why? Gasped Thomas. And where would everyone go? It's hard for steam engines to find work on the mainland nowadays, agreed his driver. He winked at the fireman. They both knew the other engines would never go, but agreed Thomas needed to be taught a lesson. By the time Percy arrived at the quarry later, the winter's first snow had already fallen. "Right on time, well done," boomed a familiar voice.
"Oh, hello, sir,"
Percy stuttered. The Fat Controller had a habit of appearing out of nowhere, and he had never quite gotten used to it. "You look nervous, Percy," he went on. "What's wrong?"
"Please, sir, the engines are threatening to leave Sodor. They told me to tell you. I don't like it, sir."
The Fat Controller was surprised.
"'Pon my soul, whatever for?"
"Well, sir, it's to do with the statue. Everyone thinks you're having a statue of Thomas to celebrate the railway. The engines don't like it and say that if the railway is to be celebrated with a statue of Thomas, then they're all leaving. That would be dreadful, sir. You've got to do something."
"I think I've some explaining to do," replied the Fat Controller. "Thank you, Percy. Hurry along with your work now. This weather looks set to get worse." The Fat Controller was right. There was another heavy fall overnight, and by next morning the countryside was piled high with thick snow.
"Last night's blizzard locked all routes to Peel Park. I'll need an engine to help clear the tracks, as the twins have been taken ill."
"I'll help, sir,"
tooted Thomas. Everyone was astonished.
"But you don't like wearing your snowplow,"
said Henry and James together.
"I wouldn't want any of you to miss the ceremony,"
puffed Thomas.
"Very well,"
said the Fat Controller,
"but be quick. You can take the Tidmouth track, as Duck is already working on the Knapford route."
The two engines worked hard all that morning, yet Thomas was still worried.
"I shall miss my friends if they all go,"
he said sadly.
"Surely they won't," soothed his driver. "After all, they'd miss Sodor too much."
"Not as much as I'd miss them,"
replied Thomas. Duck and Thomas finished at last, and it wasn't long before all the engines were gathered at Peel Station. Snow had completely blanketed the statue, but as the Fat Controller began his speech, the sun came out from behind the clouds.
"As we all know, the island of Sodor is a magnificent place to live,"
he boomed grandly. But the engines weren't listening. They were still cross.
"I've no interest in a statue of some silly tank engine," muttered Gordon. "Wasn't going to come at all, the driver made me."
"Patience, Gordon,"
Edward called.
"We'll know the truth soon enough."
But even he looked anxious. Finally, a large patch of snow slid off.
"Look at that!"
squeaked Percy. Inch by inch, the snow melted away, and the statue was unveiled. Everyone was amazed.
"Well, I'll be," Toby gasped.
"That's not Thomas!"
exclaimed Gordon.
"No, it's all of us,"
cheered Percy.
"You see," explained the Fat Controller, "we decided on a statue of you all, because you have all been so loyal and hard-working." All the engines whistled in delight. When Thomas arrived, he was surprised.
"It's not of me at all," he wished in relief.
"Now then," asked the Fat Controller sternly, "what's this I've heard about a little holiday some of you have been planning?"
The engines looked towards Gordon, but Thomas spoke out.
"It's my fault, sir," he said. "The way the statue was shaped under that tarpaulin, well, it did look rather like me."
"Then I trust there'll be no more nonsense about leaving?"
"Of course not, sir," they all chorused. "Sodor is nothing without the Fat Controller's engines. It's our wonderful home,
and forever it always shall be.